welcome to Friday. Tonight is a special show. I mean, every time we do a Friday show, it's always like, hey, let's talk about something really depressing where we all want to hang ourselves. Tonight, it's the Fed. Oh, it's going to be spooky. During the financial crisis, most Americans have heard a lot about the Federal Reserve, but most Americans don't know anything about it, how it works, what it is, who even runs it, or how it's run. We know that it buys our debt, it sets up interest rates, it has a lot to do with the economic well-being of our nation. Wouldn't you say? Where did it come from? Tonight is part of our E4 focus this year. We're going to delve into E2 and get educated on the Fed. G. Edward Griffin, he is the author of this book, and if one more person hands me this book, I'm going to snap, because I get this from so many. I go out and people are like, have you read this book? Yes, I have. May I recommend, have you read this book? If not, read it. It is The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is a fascinating book on the Fed. The author is one of our guests tonight. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to talk a little bit about what they're doing now, but I want you to know we're just going to start at the beginning, and really, we're going to give the history of the Fed as told by the Fed. The happy tale on their own website. Are you ready for this? It's great. Here we are. Here it is. Watch this. Quote on their website. After Alexander Hamilton spearheaded a movement advocating the creation of a central bank, the first bank of the United States was established in 1791. You see how great this is? The Fed was started by a founding father. No, it wasn't. No. The first bank isn't the Fed. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, nothing. But they just wanted to throw a founding father's name in there. The bank's charter ran for about 20 years. And because it took about 20 years before Americans realized, hey, that Bank of America thing, that's not working out. They've got way too much power and influence, just like all the other founders said. A proposal to renew it failed. Now back to the happy story from the Fed's website. Quote, the situation deteriorated to such an extent that in 1860, a bill to charter a second bank of the United States was introduced in Congress. The second bank was very much like the first, except bigger, about 3.5 times bigger. It's always that way, isn't it? Anyway, the charter also lasted about 20 years before people went, what are we doing? Americans realized that it wielded too much power and influence, and the proposal to renew it also failed. Then, according to the Fed's website, they got rid of that nasty charter thing in the will of the people. Quote, in 1907, a severe financial panic jolted Wall Street and forced several banks into failure. Many Americans thought their banking structure was sadly out of date and needed major reform. The first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was called the Aldrich Bill because, well, the guy who wrote it was named Aldrich, and it failed. President Taft refused to support it, and you remember he was so fat they had to have a special bathtub for him. Then it underwent some surgery and a readmission as the Glass-Owen Bill, and of course it got a signature from progressive Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Well, that's the Fed's story. Bill was introduced in 1907, and in 1913 it finally came to be. Isn't everything great in sunshine and lollipop world? The Federal Reserve Act wasn't drafted in Congress. It was drafted on a private island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. Here is the island, Jekyll Island. And it was drafted under great secrecy. Jekyll Island was the retreat for billionaires like William Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. And in 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the Republican whip in the Senate and the chair of the National Monetary Commission, sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station, where he and 5 other men were instructed to come one at a time and everybody pretend they just didn't know each other. Aldrich, who is the guy, remember, he wrote the original bill. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. Oh, and the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. So there's no special interest happening there. There was also Abram Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and Frank Vanderlip, representing William Rockefeller, Henry Davidson and Benjamin Strong with J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg. He was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was representing the Rothschild banking family. Oh, he's going to talk about the Rothschilds now. He actually is an interesting character. If you ever saw Little Orphan Annie, Daddy Warbucks was named after Warburg. These are the men that represented 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world. You think we got a problem with wealth now? Those guys, 1/4 of all of the money in the world. The Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, all in one room. Yeah, but when do they start sacrificing chickens? Well, it doesn't happen. That I'll tell you. These guys were all competitors. According to G. Edward Griffin, who we'll talk to in a minute, they all had come together to form a banking cartel so they didn't have to compete against each other. He says it was like an oil cartel or a sugar cartel, but this cartel actually went into partnership with the government. I mean, how great is that, huh? It's kind of like the drug cartels in Mexico. Wait, I didn't say that out loud, did I? So for more than a week, these men sat around there. And they sat around this big table and they hammered out all the details of what became the Federal Reserve System with 5 objectives. How many of these do you agree with? 1, to stop the growing competition from the nation's newer banks. That doesn't sound good. 2, to obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. That one really doesn't sound good either. 3, to get control of the reserves of all of the banks so the reckless ones wouldn't be exposed to currency drains or bank runs. Oh, that's the charity part. Golly gee, beef, thank you so much. Then, to shift the losses from the bank owners to the taxpayers. It just gets better and better for you and me, doesn't it? No. Again, the answer is no. And then finally, to convince Congress that the purpose was to protect the public. Well, they started the Federal Reserve with no money, just a checkbook. The government could go to the Fed and obtain instant money without having to consult the taxpayer. What a country! Money created out of nothing and then given to the government. It's loaned by the banks to you and me, and then we pay interest on it, and it goes to them. Interest on nothing. Again, the Fed is nothing more than a cartel like OPEC, except it's a money cartel. And this cartel that brought the federal government into a partnership where you and I have to answer to it. And it's only to enforce the rules of the cartel, you know, to bring those into agreement with the federal laws to protect you. It operates under the protection of the federal government, and the government has virtually given a monopoly to create the nation's money supply. There are no elected officials. There's virtually no accountability to anyone. The president doesn't get to say, I'm going to name Glenn Beck as the head of the Fed, which, oh, please. Sarah, when you're in, I'm available. Oh, did I say that one out loud too? Can't do that. The Fed gives the president a list to choose from. Really? Well, thank you, Chairman Mao. The Fed is privately owned, but by whom? Good question. No one knows. We can't open their books, and we don't know who owns them. Really? Now, here's an interesting spin from the Federal Reserve Board website. Although they're set up like private corporations and member banks hold their stock, the Federal Reserve banks owe their existence to an act of Congress and have a mandate to serve the public. Oh, therefore, they're not really private companies, but rather owned by the citizens of the United States. Well, that's fantastic. Let's all go to the bank and make a withdrawal. Or how about we lower the interest rates at the bank we own? Yeah. The next question and the answer on the site is, are Federal Reserve Bank employees considered government employees? Answer, no. Employees of the Federal Reserve banks are not government employees. They're paid as part of their expenses of their employing reserve bank. Oh, so it's like charity. That's interesting. So it's not really private and it's not really public. It's just this mysterious magic money dispenser that buys all our own debt, sets our interest rates, sets our economic policy, loans billions of dollars to other countries, helps us borrow billions of dollars from other countries, and then prints money just out of the thin air. And there's no drive-through window, but everything else sounds magical, doesn't it? Yes. I have news for you. There's a lot of people, when you start talking about the Federal Reserve, they start going into, and then the Bilderbergs, along with Colonel Sanders, got together, and they start going down crazy roads. There is no reason to do it. It's crazy enough. Let's talk about just the facts, shall we? Let me introduce you to a couple of our guests, because I think we have some interesting times ahead, and I have a feeling the audience is waiting to pounce. Edward Griffin is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, and Mike Calabria is the director of financial regulation at the Cato Institute. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you, Glenn.
Did I get it right as far as you're concerned?
Mark, but...
oh, did I say? What did I say?
I think you said Michael. But
oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
My brother will be tough.
Okay, good. So, Mark, did I get it right?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Let me go to... Now, I want to make sure I get G. G, do I call you G or do I call you Edward? Or G-Ed?
Edward will work just fine.
Okay. How about G-Money? Edward, did I get the story right, and what did I miss?
You got the story very, very right. A lot of very interesting details. Of course, we don't have time for it in a program like this, but the essence of it, you got exactly right.
Okay. What did I miss that is important? In fact, let me go here. Let me go here. I'm going to show you this timeline. And this timeline shows all of the crashes, not the panics, but the crashes in the United States. A crash in 35, one in 1880. Then it kind of picks up. 1880, 1896, 1900, 1903, 1907, then nothing till 1929, then 37, 38, 46, 62, 87. There seems to be this clump of crashes here. Is there anything nefarious about those crashes, or is this just bad policy and everything else?
Well, there are two things. First of all, you asked if there was anything that was left out. As I said, the important items were there, but there's one thing you might want to explain to the audience, and the reason for the secrecy that you mentioned. Why were they concealing their identities? Why did they deny that they went to this meeting? And the answer is because if the American people had known that this bill, which was supposed to protect the American people from the big bad bankers, was actually written by those same bankers, well, then the scam would have been out in the open. And that's why they had to keep the whole thing secret until many years after the meeting took place.
Hey, okay, so Edward, hang on just a second. We just did a story this week where the unions and all of these people are saying the big bag banks are getting all of our money. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, the unions are the ones that racked up all this debt. Then the government takes the money from the taxpayers and then has given it to the banks. The banks are the ones that are, through the central banks, causing all this problem. Mark, can you help me on this? I mean, it's...
well, very much so. I mean, what we've seen is the central bank pushing all this money into the system. The Federal Reserve very much played a key role in creating the housing bubble to begin with. I mean, you might remember after the dot-com bubble burst,
right,
after 9/11, we cut rates, the Fed cut rates, Greenspan took them to historic lows, the mortgage market, the housing market took off, and eventually that bubble was going to burst, and it burst in 2006 when the Fed started raising rates. So they played a very big role in this, and they're trying to create bubbles today. If you look at what the quantitative easing is doing, you look at the interest rates we're seeing now.
Would you agree with me? It's the last one. It's the last bubble. I think I dubbed this maybe in 2005. I think I said housing bubble, and then we're going to have the last one, the money bubble.
Yes.
It is the last one, too.
Well, let's hope it's the last one. I suspect that after this bubble burst, the Fed's going to look for a way to try to create another bubble to try to make us forget about the last bubble. And that's really the way they were doing it. And there's a very conscious attitude in 2003, 2004 to say, okay, we're coming off this recession across with the dot-com bubble. What do we do to make people feel wealthier? What do we do to get people to go out and spend? And what they decided to do was, let's gin up the housing market. Everybody will feel like they have a lot of money.
Right.
It'll a lot of people to work. And so what are they trying to do now? Let's gin up the stock market. So it really is creating one bubble to try to offset the effect of the last bubble.
So, Edward, let me go back to you. We see the way they're working the bubbles now, but let me go back into the past. We see this clump of crashes here. And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like a panic in the 1890s, either 1892 or 1896, where I believe it was J.P. Morgan that loaned money to the United States. He came in and personally bailed out and said, I'll lend you money. Then another one happened in like 03, and he said, you know, I can't do this anymore. You guys are on your own, but I'll get my friends together and bail you guys out one more time, and they did. And that's what kind of led to this, correct?
Well, that's exactly the historic origin of it, but I think underlying this, we have to recognize the principle of the Ponzi scheme. The system really is a Ponzi scheme as we're living through it right now. It works as long as the money supply continues to expand and expand and expand, like any Ponzi scheme. You pay off the first investors so that they're very happy. They bring in the new investors. As long as it expands, it works. But when it finally stops, the whole thing comes to an end. That's why they have to keep expanding the money supply. Well, when you create money out of nothing, you also face the fact that money goes back into nothing. So this kind of a system makes the expansion and contraction inevitable. The booms and the busts are inevitable. If the money were backed by something solid, like gold or silver, that you just couldn't create out of thin air, well, then there wouldn't be these contractions or expansions. It would be a nice, even playing field.
Most people think that our money is kind of backed by something in Fort Knox. And I have talked to several congressmen who have asked to go see the gold in Fort Knox, and they can't go see the gold in Fort Knox. It is, I mean...
That's, you know, sort of surprising, because one would think that congressmen and I can understand why they might not let me see it. I might want to take some of it out with me.
Well, the largest collection of gold is here at the Federal Reserve, right?
Exactly.
And that's not American money, that's the Fed's.
That's the Fed's, and a lot of what the New York Federal Reserve keeps is gold for other people.
Right.
Like there might be gold for the Bank of England here in New York that they're keeping, and they quite often will just put it on a cart and move it from one person's account to another.
Edward, do you believe we have gold in Fort Knox? I mean, a lot of gold in Fort Knox? Is it still there?
I think it's very naive to think that we have any gold there for the reason you said. If they had it, they would show it. It's as simple as that.
Okay,
they don't have any gold there.
Back in just a second.